Hi, welcome back to KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. If this is your first time listening in, welcome. We're happy to have you join us. Our mission is simple: to share inspiring stories and journeys from individuals who embarked on the path of continuous improvement. Through these interviews with leaders, innovators, and change makers, we explore the sparks that ignite transformative journeys, both within organizations and in personal growth. So whether you're just starting out or looking to take your improvement efforts to the next level, this podcast is here to guide, inspire, and empower you. Today's guest is Andrei Anca. Andrei is an expert in lean and continuous improvement. He's an author, a speaker, a consultant. Andrei has written a book, one of my favorite books. It's called Lead from Any Seat. And I personally have bought probably over 20 or 50 of these books. I share them with lots of people. I refer to it a lot. I've got it dog-eared and I pull it up and make references to it. So it's definitely one of my favorites. Andrei has a way of teaching the lean and continuous improvement concepts that are incredibly useful and very approachable. And he regularly publishes content on LinkedIn. So if you don't follow him, go ahead and do it. It's Andrei, Andrei, Anca, Anca. Well, let's just jump into our conversation. It's been a few months since we've spoken. I think last time I actually saw you in person was in Boston, maybe close to 2 years ago now. But
A while ago.
yeah, what
It's
have you
come.
been up to for the last few months? I think you were maybe doing a little bit of traveling or heading over to Europe or something last time I
Actually,
spoke
last
with
year
you.
was yes. Last year was almost like a record travel year for me. I went to Japan, I went to Switzerland and Italy. So definitely a very busy year on traveling, which is definitely one of my hobbies. And as you probably remember, I also like photography. So kind of like to merge those two. So it was a great year for me.
Well, that's awesome. One of the things that we like to start with our podcast is I always find that the people that I meet that are involved in this thing that I refer to as continuous improvement, sometimes people refer to it by other terms. Some people are very like, this is lean or this is Six Sigma or this is continuous improvement or whatever it is. So I'm curious to hear a little bit about your perspective on that. But tell us a little bit about your journey. How did you first become aware of this thing that we call continuous improvement was like a possible career path? I'm assuming that you might have started out with some other interest and then, kind of got turned on to this at some point. Tell us a little bit about that journey.
Well, so I've been doing continuous improvement, Keith, as you probably know, for almost 20 years now. So I've been kind of like so passionate about, anything Lean Six Sigma, operational excellence, continuous improvement, that, like driving efficiencies, helping organizations solve problems and, helping people actually work smarter, not harder, right? So how I got into this? Well, I think was somewhat by accident. I was trying to, I had always had this mindset, trying to question things, make things better. And I always had the curiosity, how things work. Can we do things better? Can we do things with less work so we can repurpose the time? All right. So in the beginning of my career, I was actually thrown into important problems, important projects, and I was trying to find my way without a structured approach, like to solve problems, complex problems. And I was thinking, I wish there was something more structured for me because it's easy to get excited in the beginning, right? Try to solve everything without having some discipline around it. So at that time, my manager told me they have a program for Lean Six Sigma, which is very much along the lines with having some methodology, some structures around problem solving, continuous improvement. So he asked me if I wanna join that program. So I did like a long training in Boise, Idaho for, I don't know, like 6 weeks, a month apart. So a lot of travel, a lot of learning, couple of projects done in that time frame, and I really loved it. I said, this is definitely something that adds a lot of value, and I was super, super excited about. So the rest is history.
I'm just curious, like what
Sure.
industry, what
Yeah,
kind of
that
work was
was
that?
that was retail. So that time was called Super Value. So Albertsons probably. So there was like a very big chain of supermarkets and warehousing logistics for retail.
Wow, yeah, a lot of high volume, process intensive. You can probably make a big impact with some small
Yeah.
changes there and big changes too. That's a very complicated supply chain for sure.
Absolutely. And, like, it was interesting to see because reading in books and learning about Lean and Six Sigma, being focused so much in manufacturing. It was interesting to see how it can apply to customer service, to like retail and logistics and warehousing. But like kind of like open my eyes a little bit to realize that, we can take those concepts and tools and apply in different industries. Um, After that, I actually worked myself in automotive, insurance, banking, manufacturing, doing kind of like applying the same concepts, the same methodology, same tools to different industries. So I want people, the listeners, to understand that when you hear Lean and Six Sigma, don't get discouraged and don't think it's just for manufacturing. That's not the case.
Yeah, that's a really great insight. And that's one of the reasons why I love to have these conversations, because I find myself, I work in knowledge work and software, and so much of what I'm studying or learning lean, you think manufacturing, but work is work. So
Exactly.
that's great to hear about your experience across different industries. I'm curious, you mentioned lean and you mentioned Six Sigma. How do you view this world of, I'm using the term continuous improvement, but you've had some different exposure to it. I don't know if you have like a label that you put on it or how you think about the different pieces of it, but how do you view this thing we call continuous improvement? This book that you wrote, Lead from Any Seat, I don't think I see anything about lean or continuous improvement or Six Sigma, you know what I mean? Like on this book, like you've got a really, what I think it's unique. I think that's one of the things I really like about it is it's like, hey, wherever you're at in the organization, there's something here for you. So I'm curious, how did that perspective maybe influence you to write this book?
So that's actually by design, right? I purposely didn't want to put anything on the cover to intimidate people because, as I said earlier, I feel like there's so much opportunity to apply these concepts to different industries. Typically, when people hear Lean and Six Sigma, they get scared, they get intimidated. Oh my God, Six Sigma, numbers, regression analysis, whatever, and lean at cost, you gotta let people go, right? Well, that's not what it is. So I feel like lean is more like, you don't even have to call it lean, right? Continuous improvement, whatever the case may be. I think it's a mindset and a strategy, right? It's not like a project or a program. It's not necessarily a set of tools. And to me, it's about minimizing waste. I've worked for a lot of organizations, and I feel like the most successful ones when it comes to continuous improvement, were able to embed these concepts into their culture, not necessarily make it like a big initiative. Okay, we're gonna start something new now. We're just gonna start a bunch of projects and check the box type of thing, right? I feel like people need to understand that this concept can be used and applied, and you don't have to put a label of them. You don't necessarily have to call it lean. You don't have to necessarily call it, I don't know, Six Sigma, right? As long as you add value, as long as, and I like, to say, like, instead of saying, we're not cutting costs, we're looking to create capacity, right? So think about my current job right now. I work in finance now. We're looking, how can we create capacity so we can focus on more meaningful work? Right. So obviously there is a lot of waste, but there's a lot of opportunity now with automation, AI, and the list goes on and on, right? How can we identify waste? How can we make things better to free up capacity? Focus on better, more value-added things, increase employee satisfaction so people are not burned out nights, weekends, right? So in other words, how do we make things better and how do we add value provide better value to our customers, internal or external?
I like that. That's a great point. I think one of my questions here for you is around this idea of what are some of the mistakes that companies make in either their implementation of lean or their approach to lean. I think you hinted at, or you've directly mentioned a few of those things, but let's talk about that, because I know you've been involved in some companies that um, had some interesting experiences with lean.
Well, so my personal opinion, I think if you make too much of like a bigger deal out of this program, it's going to fail at some point. I feel like you have to introduce, first of all, it cannot, as I said earlier, it cannot be a check the box kind of like type of exercise, right? It cannot focus on cost cutting. If you're just looking for cost, it's not gonna work, right? And if you don't have the leadership buy-in from the top, it's going to fail, right? So people have to be on board and really understand. So I think those are the top mistakes I've seen. Either you don't have buy-in, you look at it like purely cutting costs. Oh, we had a bad year. let's implement lean to cut costs, maybe, have some reduction in personnel and save some money. That's a huge mistake. I think that sends the wrong message, and I don't think that would be a setup for success, for sure, from what I've seen. And I can tell you from experience, and this is like, it's reality. So a lot of companies, so the life cycle of a program is, if it's not run well, is everybody gets excited in the beginning. They start the program, they see some benefits, right? And then it starts kind of like to die down. And then they're not as excited because now the potential benefits are not as shiny type of thing and big, right? And then they have some org changes, and you have new leadership who doesn't believe in that, and the whole program ends. So I've been through that 3 times. Okay, different companies. Never fails. It's just the same thing. People don't see the value of it. And at some point, they look at these programs as overhead rather than value creation. So I think that's one of the big mistakes. And again, that's the reality out there. I mean, probably there are companies who have, like, for example, Ocean Spray. I worked for them for quite a while, right? So they're manufacturing, they make cranberry juice, craisins and such. They had a better culture of continuous improvement. And that's probably because they're manufacturing, right? But there are other companies I worked for that they kind of like follow the life cycle that I just told you. So that's 2 to 3 years lifespan. So again, I think it's definitely the wrong approach they take, and they really don't see the value. I don't want to blame that on the company. I want to blame that also on the people who run the program. Because as I said earlier, the goal is to embed that into the culture. You want to empower people and have people kind of like take initiative, hence my book, right? Take the lead and learn some tools that they can apply. And I think it goes both ways. You can't just blame. You have to see both sides.
I think that's great. I talk to a lot of folks and I hear a lot of experiences that are kind of similar. And there's a life cycle with an organization. There's a life cycle with a program. I want to just punctuate a few things that I think I heard you say. Treating lean or continuous improvement or Six Sigma as a project or as a program that you're going to implement real quickly and then be done with is a recipe for a short-term program. I personally, I've heard this story a lot. I've seen this. I'm really a big fan of just even the concept of language. Some people are very adverse to using like the Japanese parts of continuous improvement. I'm a big fan of just the term continuous improvement or even business improvement, because I think it's really hard to argue that the job of all of us in leadership in any organization is really to try to make things better, to try to improve the business. So every organization should always have some sort of a business improvement strategy. We should always be continuing to improve. I would almost describe it as more of a core value or a strategy as opposed to an initiative or a program. I'm curious if you've given any thought to like the language of how that is phrased and if that has any meaning to you.
Well, I can tell you, I stay away from Japanese terms as much as I can. So in my current job right now, we started actually in a wave two. So we started like we call it a CI ambassador program, where we teach like the A3 methodology, and each of the ambassadors is a project. So through the duration of the program, which is about like 3 to 4 months, they're able to learn some tools and run a project. And when I developed the modules, me and my colleagues, we really purposely stayed away from anything Ishikawa, Kaizen, like any Japanese terms. Because again, these are people who have their day jobs. And it just happened that some of them are, with 120% capacity. So they really have to put up a lot of effort above and beyond to make this happen, right? So I learned that the hard way, right? You kind of like try to throw out there so many terms because just so you showcase your knowledge and you get excited, and people look at you like, "What the hell are you talking about?" They like you lose them, right? So again, it's different on a, like, let's say, manufacturing environment with a more mature continuous improvement culture. When you look at like service industry, right? That's a little different there. So as you said, sometimes you call it business improvement. It doesn't matter as long as the word improvement is there, and as long as you avoid Japanese terms as much as possible. I mean, really, people, if they want to learn more, if they want to pursue like a certification, like a green belt, black belt, whatever, they'll learn that. But for the most part, the way I look at it, like continuous improvement, okay, I want to grow the culture. I want to show some results. I'm always about results. So I feel that through my career, every time I try to inject some kind of like Japanese terms and make it like too technical, that was not very successful. That's my
Yeah.
experience.
So you talked about driving results. You talked about this thing called savings, which I find is a very interesting topic and sometimes polarizing because on one hand, I see very mature, very large companies, multinational, multi-billion dollar companies that have what you would say is a very well-established program for continuous improvement lean. And a lot of times it manifests in the form of some sort of cost savings targets. They're saving costs. Now, of course, you got to drive a lot of operational metric improvements in those cost savings. But you talked about showing results. I think there's a difference between just pursuing only cost savings versus paying attention to the results that your program's doing. Because I would assume that we would agree that anything that's going to maintain a place in the budget of a company has to be able to show some results. So can you maybe give us an example of like how a CI program or somebody leading a project or a program can show results if it isn't just about savings?
Well, so there are multiple ways. So we look at them, like we have like, we call them hard benefits. So those are the benefits, the results that you actually quantify. Let's say we talk about capacity, right? We created, freed up like 2,000 hours this quarter, right? So it's kind of like not super difficult to put a number to that. So we estimate like an average, like dollar per hour, and you can kind of like come up with the benefits. Another example would be reducing number of errors. So it's probably there are more related to like less rework, risk avoidance, and those are pretty hard to quantify, right? What's an error? What error worth in dollars? You can't really put a number to that. Okay, or one of my previous jobs, we did a project to avoid like more like regulatory. We were getting fined by the states because of non-compliance. I mean, we had to pay, let's say, $2 million fine. Fine. There is no guarantee that we're gonna get fined again, because it's like a random audit, right? But that would be like a risk avoidance. All right. Or like you have different customers, right? Like KPI Fire. My biggest customer is KPI Fire, and they're upset with me because I'm not delivering, right? Well, what's KPI Fire worth to me if I lose them, if my client goes somewhere else? So sometimes you are creative, right? But bottom line, Keith, I feel like before you begin a project, you need to understand what's your objective, what's the scope, and what's the problem, and how big is the problem. You need to have some kind of baseline. Because otherwise, how would you even know if you move the needle and you get to the end, right? So there's no excuse there. If you don't have a baseline, you need to start collecting it right away when you begin the project. And sometimes it's just estimates, but you can't just go through all this effort and 3 months later just say, "Oh, we improved." How do you know? How do you know it's a problem? First of all, because if you don't have any metrics, any numbers, it's just nobody believes that. So I want to take this moment to emphasize the importance of metrics. And a lot of companies struggle with that. They struggle with good data. They struggle with metrics. They struggle with the concept. Well, this is a problem. How many errors? Well, a lot. Well, 1, 10. I don't know. Well, okay. So how do you know it's a problem? Maybe you have other bigger problems that you could address and prioritize. But if you don't have any numbers, I think that's a big problem for sure.
That's one of my favorite questions. What is the actual problem we are trying to solve? And sometimes, I'm sure you and I and listeners have been in those meetings where people are talking and debating, and sometimes these things can go on for a while. And you get to the point where you're like, what is the actual problem that we're trying to solve? So I
Oh,
love that
it's
you
all the
that you
time.
focused on that.
Absolutely. That happens.
Yeah.
Like you
And
go
how
to
do
like
we
a
know it's an
workshop.
actual problem?
Yeah. And how do you know it's the biggest problem? Maybe you have bigger fish to fry. Maybe there are like some burning issues there, that we need to address. So even in the prioritization process, when you start working on something, right, you need to have some kind of idea. Okay, how big is this problem, and how do we move at the end? You can measure along the way. You can measure at the end. Made a change? Have I made a difference? Have we moved the needle? But yeah, that's definitely crucial.
You mentioned something else there that I want to come back to is the idea of the metrics and the data and what is the greater objective. And again, part of the purpose of this podcast and the type of people that we're trying to talk to and part of the message that we're trying to resonate with is, yes, this is stuff that's good for companies. Of course, companies need to get better, but this skill set, these tools, this way of thinking is good for individuals too. Just like you on your career path and me on mine. Like, I believe that everybody would rather be working in a company that they feel engaged and valuable and productive in solving good problems that make the world a better place and make them more money. That's just a real, when they're not, there's some reason why. And, there's lots of good ideas that are in companies that don't ever see the light of day because the person that sees the problem doesn't know how to articulate it or doesn't know how to get other people on board. So maybe you could come back to that point from like the perspective of advice. What kind of, and maybe there's some tools that you refer to in your book of tricks to like make it visual or to, to put it with a metric.
So two main reasons why I decided to write the book. Number one, because I felt like, frontline employees, people who do the work have all this great idea, just like you said, and they're not sure what to do about. And second reason, as a manager, managing people, I was kind of like sick of and tired of people coming to me. Well, here's a problem. We have another problem. I've been saying this for months. Okay, so what am I supposed to do, right? So that's why I wanted to create a book with some tools that I thought would help people get started. Like, for example, I don't want to necessarily call it Project Chart, so that's how I call it in the book, I think, but kind of like, okay, what's the problem? How big is the problem? What are the metrics? What are the stakeholders? Kind of like to get that mindset. And then a tool like process mapping, right? What's the current process? And I always say, you don't have to get hung up. Should I use Visio? Should I use Excel? Should I use Miro? Whatever, other software. Whatever you want to use a napkin. But my point is when you go to the manager pointing out a problem, I like people to have some kind of approach. And I don't necessarily need them to come up with a solution. At least I like to see they did some legwork. They understand the context. They understand the potential issue, right? And that's a different discussion I would have with that employee rather than just coming to me, well, this has been a problem for a year with no background, no information, no specifics, no metrics, right? So I feel like anyone who wants to start that, I want them to know that you don't need a title to start leading an initiative. You can take the initiative from where you are today, right? What you need to do is you have the desire to change things and take the initiative. And I think the book provides people with some approach, right? And some simple tools. And some of them are more complex, right? But again, like basically what you want to do, you understand the current state process, understand the gaps, how do you close the gaps, right? I mean, it's just that simple. And some tools in the book help you get there. And another important thing is, I'm very definitely passionate about that, getting to the root cause of the problem, because more often than not, you may find yourself addressing symptoms instead of the root cause. And guess what? The problem keeps coming back and back and back and back. I thought I just fixed it. No, you did not. You did not address the root cause. You address some of the symptoms. So of course the problem comes back. So tools like 5-why analysis, maybe like a fishbone, they really help you, again, they're not super complicated. They're pretty straightforward, but they are definitely help you get to the root cause of the problem and make sure you solve for that root cause.
I think the root cause is one of those concepts that generally sounds like common sense. I think a lot of people are like, "Oh yeah, I understand what root cause analysis is." Can you think of an example from one of your projects or something that you've done that maybe illustrates the idea of the initial root cause? The initial thing you thought was the cause was not the root cause.
Well, so I'm not going to give you, obviously, for confidentiality reasons in the name of the company, but just to make it more generic. So we had a problem with some invoices. I mean, talking about millions of dollars not being paid by our clients, right? And they did some investigation and they realized that the invoices were missing some of the information. So not all the data points that the client was looking for or on those reports on the invoices, therefore they're rejecting a lot of invoices, right? So what they did, they said, well, you need to hire some temps. So they increased the size of the group. Okay, let's get this done. Let's do the research. And then I said, well, guys, let's go to the source. right? So go to IT and say, hey, I need these pieces of information, like 3 or 4 pieces of information this client is complaining about. They're not paying the invoices. So obviously, we don't get the money until like 2 or 3 months later, after like, hundreds of hours of additional work and people like spinning their wheels. And how simple is that? They said, sure. So, I mean, obviously we had to open a ticket, whatever. Within like a month, the problem was fixed. The software was updated to pull all this information, right? So we didn't need like 8 additional people to do manual research, right? That's why I was so happy to be able to identify that. I said, you didn't address the root cause. Like, this is like busy work. Just let's get to the root cause. So this is just kind of like to tell you like how simple, but people don't think like that, right? Let's say they think, okay, what's the problem? They're not paying. Why? Why? Because not all the information, the required information is there. Okay, let's put the information there manually. If you use the 5 why analysis and you keep asking why the information is not there, because it's not transferred from the source system. Okay, why? Because it's not written in the code. Oh, okay. Why? Because when you get to a point on like, well, because I don't know, maybe they didn't know, then
Because no one ever
you
asked
know,
for that or something, It's
right.
usually,
So like, okay, how would the technology department even know? They're so far removed, right, from the client, right? So they wouldn't even know. They've been doing that for all the clients. It just happened this particular client had very strict requirements, right? So this is just an example to show how powerful why analysis and getting to the root causes can be.
that's such an interesting topic, because another thing that I see happen is I see people present solutions, like, hey, we need to do this, we need to do this, without taking the time to explain what problem that solution is solving. And so sometimes they'll feel like nobody's listening to me, nobody cares. But oftentimes, like the idea itself might not get the traction, but when you can, tie it back to a problem, and a problem that people care about, is you can move the needle a lot. I have another question for you. I come across this scenario. I hear this, in what we do with KPI Fire and strategy execution. I oftentimes will hear people say things like, I'm waiting for the senior leadership to tell us what the strategic plan is, or some version of that. And that can exist everywhere in an organization. And I think at the same time, the senior leaders, particularly in bigger companies, they're like, well, I'm pretty sure we hired smart people. I'm kind of new here anyways. I'm just going to let them keep doing what they've been doing and not try to mix things up too much. So I have this kind of analogy of like, picture a high school dance where the boys and the girls are, kind of hoping that the other one asks them to dance. But I think the title of your book and maybe your message is something along the lines of, you probably have some idea of some areas you could make some improvement, and what might somebody do to feel more empowered or proactive than just like, oh, I'm waiting to be told what the goals are.
You need to start small. So you can wait all you want for the leadership to make up their mind for the strategic goals. So best case scenario, they're gonna eventually come up with some strategic goals. They're gonna trickle down, come to your level, and they're gonna be so generic. And so for people who do the work, I'm sure they come across opportunities. And even if it's a small opportunity, if you have like 5 different spreadsheets that you use and like across a scenario similar, one of my projects, right? And a lot of copy and paste is like what, 2025, right? Just question that. Like, okay, there obviously, every time you have so much manual work and manual intervention, there's a huge risk for error, right? Can I do that better? Can I delete some of the tabs that I haven't used in a year, right? Or question that. Does anybody use that? Do I still have to wait for a report from a department that always has a zero balance and it delays my process because I have to wait for it, but it never has any amount there? So why would I have to wait? Can I question that? Can I pick up the Slack somebody or whatever, send an email? Is it still relevant? I mean, the process has been like this for 5, 10 years. I never ever seen a balance. So those are small things that you can address right away. You don't have to wait for a strategic, goals from the leadership. You can do right away. You can question that, take that initiative. So that's why I'm saying start small. You don't have to start with a big cross-functional project. It just start with small improvements, and trust me, they add up, right? It may not seem like it's going to save me half an hour. Well, okay. If everybody would save half an hour in your group, okay, and then another half an hour, that at the end of the year, you could save a significant amount of time and you can use that time for better things.
Let me drill down on this topic of operational excellence in organization structure, right? Let me give you a scenario. Let's say you're the CEO or the founder of a huge company, it's some multi-billion-dollar family office, and you get to decide exactly how this operational excellence thing is going to be implemented worldwide for your large company with multiple business units, maybe a dozen plants or something. How would you describe the structure of that program from organizational structure, like headcount and side of like roles and responsibilities?
Well, so it's always a little challenging because you always wonder, is it better to start big from the top and say, okay, I'm the CEO of company, I have a big company, and would I create deployments in each of the organizations that I have, different states, countries, whatever, or just start small in one of the groups, show some value, so create some excitement, and then other groups are gonna say, I've seen that happening, it really helped, so now let's grow that program. For me, I would definitely go with option number two rather than just starting from the top. I've seen that happening. Oh, we're going to start a big continuous improvement project, right? So I feel like people get so caught up into like getting the program organized and getting the tools, the people. And it's just, I feel like it's very slow to deliver results. So for that reason, to me, the sooner you show some results, the more momentum we create, and I feel like people get more excited, more buy-in, right? If you build something, I'm not saying it's right or wrong, and I've seen it done both ways, but typically, if you have a big company, you want representation.
If we were in a court of law, this might be considered a leading question. So I'll just warn you. So I think we're in agreement the idea that the best case scenario, every employee everywhere has good ideas and they're just making lots of little improvements all over the place, right? In something that I might call just a best practice that I've seen work is you've got somebody who's a champion at a particular site who's kind of carrying the flag and saying, "Hey, let me take some responsibility for recognizing and sharing some of these success stories of these improvements." Maybe it's at an individual plant and you've got, I mean, hopefully managers just do this as part of their work anyways, right? They're bridging the work across silos and sharing best practices and communicating the good work and recognizing that. But I wonder if, based on your experience, you've seen, I mean, you kind of talked about how some organizations are just too focused on savings. So maybe like just being only focused on hard savings is maybe not ideal. Maybe there's some other behaviors that let's call it the directors of operational excellence could do or should do with the organization to help create that good culture that you're talking about so that it doesn't get overly focused on just savings.
I started to mention ocean spray. So, they had like at that time, I think 5 or 6 plants across the US. So they had continuous improvement, operational excellence in each of the plants, right? Kind of like operating like silos. And exactly what you said. When I was brought in at corporate level, aside from us having an operational excellence program at corporate, we also wanted to bring everyone together and create some kind of like standardization across. Just to form people share, like, okay, because you're doing things differently, different backgrounds, different approaches. But again, that's manufacturing, right? So you did not have to avoid using Japanese terms because they kind of like new, right? So kind of like a different environment, right? But that worked pretty well. I mean, obviously, we were able to get, everyone speaking the language, right? So just getting everyone to think the same, to follow the same methodology, same tools, kind of like have some standardization, including the corporate office. I feel like that worked pretty well for that particular company.
Excellent. Excellent. Yeah, I think this one topic that I find interesting to have philosophical discussions about is variation versus standardization and flexibility versus control in this. Because like you said, you want to have people innovate, you want to have them try new things. So that kind of pulls you towards the variation side of things. But then when you find something that works, you want to say like, look, this is the standard. So, let's implement this standard. We're opening up a new plant. We can do whatever we want. So we're going to do it based on our best known practice. I don't know if you have any comments on the idea of variation versus standards and when to take some and say this is a standard.
I'm not like necessarily a very big fan of like standardization and following specific rules and being very rigid. However, from a manufacturing company, you buy a product that could be made in Wisconsin or Texas, right? You want to make sure that's consistent. So I think there are certain scenarios that you do want to ensure that you have standardization and consistency across the board as much as possible, if that may impact your final product, right? Because if you buy something, like a brand name or whatever, you want that to be consistent. Well, this is not the case. For example, I buy pants sometimes, same brand, made in different places, and that's a problem. That's not a good customer experience. And I'm not just saying it's just from because of the operational excellence part, but it's the lack of standardization. So that's why I'm trying to say, like, in my group right now, we do have some standards, some guardrails, but we have the flexibility to kind of like adapt and respond to the business, how we want to tackle problems, what tools to use and such. But there are instances that, you kind of like need that standardization.
I'm curious if there's maybe something that you didn't experience personally, or maybe you heard a story about. But and I'll give you an example. There was a book that I was listening to the other day, and it was talking about one of these booking websites that books trips or books vacations. Like it's an e-commerce type thing. People log in, and they had this metric that they had optimized around that had something to do with like phone calls and calling in, and they had created this behavior where they were incenting a lot of phone calls, essentially, right? And then somebody stepped back and looked at the problem and was like, shouldn't our objective be to give them an experience where the customers don't have to call us for this help? So sometimes like choosing the wrong metric can create like a bad outcome. I'm curious if you have any like personal experience or a story where there was maybe an incentive in place or a metric in place that had some good consequences.
Well, so something pretty similar, right? So one of my jobs, we had to outsource a few jobs, some jobs to the Philippines in the claims department. Part of their problem is there were some rejected claims or something. So they're working with these rejected claims and everything. And they had like metrics to do so many claims per hour and process them and everything. And I'm like, why do you get those anyway? You shouldn't be getting them. If you pay them correctly the first time, right? Why would just disputes? So we created a whole team, like 12 people, I thought, just to have. So we had to step back. I said, we don't want that. And kind of like they were bragging about how well they're doing now because they're saving a lot of money by moving the jobs to the Philippines. But they're missing the whole point just in the book that you listen to, right? Why in the world do we get them? Obviously that's a sign of a bigger problem. We're not paying them correctly, or something is broken somewhere else. It kind of like, so, I mean, obviously there's a lot of work to be done around that, but I thought it was pretty comical that they had all the charts and everything working on like disputes and rejects. I'm like, okay. It's not like we processed, I don't know how many, even more this month. Well, that's a big problem for the company, right? If you
Yeah.
got more, you shouldn't have gotten any. So now the number is going up and they're able to keep up, but that's not the point. The point is that something somewhere is really, really broken.
A productivity metric that incents making more mistakes or causing more problems, I guess, is kind of the idea
Exactly.
there.
Like, yeah, why do you need to even brag about it and show charts and metrics and progress and month and year over year? Initially, I didn't understand the problem, but I did. I'm like, oh, wow.
I mean, you've obviously made a choice to devote your career, at least up to this point, to this thing we call continuous improvement or operational excellence, some version of this. I'm curious, let's say step one for someone was getting introduced to your book because, somebody says, hey, this is a great book. And they're like, this is kind of intriguing. What maybe advice or mentoring would you give to someone to say, hey, if you want to learn more about this discipline, what advice might you give them, or what things could you tell them about where they should look?
Well, so there's so much out there, and I feel like it's easy to get overwhelmed. I mean, the book is definitely a starting point. It has some tools, but I do feel like the book helps build a foundation, kind of like to make sure that people are in the right mindset. They're ready to take action, they're ready to take initiative. And I think the tools in the book can help them get started. Well, if they are more interested, depending on their time, how much time they want to dedicate. Obviously, that's like LinkedIn Learning. Talk to your employer, right, and express interest. I'm sure a lot of companies have some kind of programs, and they can probably sponsor you and put you to like a formal training program if you want to become a green belt, black belt, and so on. If you want to do this more like full time. But again, as I said, like I feel like you need to get hands-on experience. All the books in the world, they're great, but nothing beats like solving some problems, seeing some results, right? So that's why I encourage people to focus on, not get hung up on like tools and methodologies in the beginning, try to do some real life, problem solving, solve a small problem, show some results, show some, improvement. So that's kind of like, building blocks, right? I think that's the very first step.
Have you ever seen a company that doesn't have any problems to solve?
Yet, so hopefully my lifetime I will, but if that would be the case, people in continuous improvement will not have jobs, so probably it's not a good idea.
How about this? Have you ever seen a company that had, I mean, I guess I would say, I think every company could use more good problem solvers, because if they had the right people solving the problems, the things that are problems, would be solved.
Problems,
I don't,
and then not only that, like even problem finders, because sometimes it's very hard to know what's causing the problem.
ooh, that's a really good insight.
Yeah, because if you don't even think about it, and again, like I feel like at least if you point me in the right place, even though you may not have the ability to fix that,
I do think that
if
that's
you
a
narrow things
point of
down.
differentiation. Yeah, being a problem finder versus a problem solver versus a problem pointer. Some people are good at saying
Oh,
that.
pointer, that's the worst.
Yeah, right. But being a problem finder, I like the way you've, maybe just for the sake of defining that, how would you differentiate a problem pointer, a problem finder, and a problem solver?
Well, a problem pointer is like 99% of the people, unfortunately, employees, they would say, here you go. I told you this doesn't work. It's been a problem since I got here 5 years ago. Okay, fine, thanks. Now, this next step would be problem finder. Well, this has been a problem, but you know what? I learned exactly where it's coming from. When whatever department does whatever X process, they miss a few steps and they don't provide the information that fine, that I know where the problem is. Now I can narrow that down. I can go after that, right? Problem solver is like the person who really steps up above and beyond and say, you know what? I'm gonna get a few people together. I'm gonna do a root cause analysis, cross-functional team, have a half an hour meeting, and see why can they do whatever they're supposed to do to make our life easier. So it's a big difference. But again, problem pointers, I don't want to deal with them around me because I mean, typically you have as a manager, you may have like 2 jobs ago. I had the big organization. I had like 6 direct reports and plus 40 plus people. Well, if everyone came to me with problems, as a manager, you're only one person.
Yeah,
What are you supposed to do? I
I
felt like saying, guys,
I agree with
thank
you. It
you.
is,
I need help.
yeah, those people can be a drain on energy and just enjoyment in work sometimes. But I also think that that's part of a leadership opportunity, and part of like teaching people what this continuous improvement discipline is to somewhat empower them and be like, you know what? Congratulations for seeing that problem. Now let's empower you to solve it. Because I've seen this light bulb click on for people sometimes, and this has happened for me on this podcast when I've asked people to explain the moment when the light went on for them, that they weren't just a cog in the machine, but they were actually somebody who could do something about it. And it was like this empowering shift that happens for people. And I think it's part of that thing that separates people that make a difference and make a change and probably have an increased level of satisfaction and enjoyment about work and life in general, versus people who feel like the world just happens to them.
Especially now in these times, right? With like people, I don't think any employers is looking anymore for people who just keep the head down and pushing buttons and doing tasks, busy work, because talking about technology, AI, and so on, and things are going to get even more advanced faster than we can even think, right? So those people, again, it's good they get a paycheck to feed their family, but there's not the people that you want to rely on to solve problems. If they don't have that drive, that initiative, they just feel like just, I'm doing my job, go home at 5 o'clock and I'm done. It's tough, but there are a lot of people out there, like that. But again, like if you want to move up, if you want to advance your career, if you want to make a difference, I encourage everyone to step up regardless of the title. Don't wait to become a leader. Leaders who are very narcissistic and it's all about them. They don't care about people. It's all about their career progression. And I've seen people with no title that actually got stuff done. They got a few coworkers together. Let's figure this out. Even though they didn't have tools or anything, but they got more done. That's leadership for me. Like getting up, stepping up, and getting stuff done.
I think that's good. That just that curiosity, or maybe that sometimes impatience, is a good spark to to push in the right direction. You mentioned something that's on my list to ask about is this AI. Everybody right now is worried about AI taking all the jobs and doing all these things. I think that one thing that is certain about the coming years is that there's going to be a lot of change. Do you have any takes on AI or the future of AI in this discipline, this type of work?
So I've explored AI for some of my projects. I feel like we are still in the very early stages. However, things are moving fast. And my prediction is that AI will help us identify probably inefficiencies a little faster, right? It will not replace problem solving skills. I think that's critical, and I think it's difficult to replace, kind of like the mindset and solving problems. But I do think that AI can help with a lot of efficiencies. I feel like it'll be able to, it can teach your model certain things, and they can just do the work for you much faster. And I also see like a big shift, and this has been happening for the past few years, right? Continuous improvement and lean being implemented in other industries like healthcare and finance, not just manufacturing. So I think across the board, we're going to see more and more because it's going to be needed, right? And I also think a big gap right now, and I feel like in the future, we're going to have more need for change management skills along with continuous improvement skills, because I do feel like they absolutely go hand in hand. And more often than not, we talk change management after we develop the solution and we're ready to implement. And that's where things break because people are not ready. They're not willing to change. You get pushed back, and it's all that great work that goes into, you can have the best solution, the best software, the best improvement ever. If you don't do the change management right and start early, it could be a disaster. It's going to be wasted time, wasted effort. So I feel like that's definitely in the future. We'll need that. We need to see more of that for any operational excellence CI practitioners out there.
I think that's true. You mentioned how I see that change management skill as an important tool in the toolbox, you might say, of continuous improvement, even the EQ type skills as well, work critical. That is, yeah, I think I definitely agree with you that there's lots of changes. AI is going to enable a lot of things. I don't think that we're going to run out of changes that need to be made and problems to solve. So for practitioners in this world, I think being on the front end of the changes, being the problem finders and the problem solvers is going to be a better, safer, from a career perspective, place to be than waiting for somebody to move your cheese, as the book goes.
Exactly.
That's good. Well, Andrei, I really appreciate your time today here. If you haven't got a copy of this, check it out. Lead from Any Seat. I think the website is leadfromanyseat.com. Is that right?
Yep, exactly. And I have templates. So the book has a link with templates if you want to use any of the tools to download them for free. So, and also you can reach out, via LinkedIn, like on TikTok, Instagram, everywhere.
Wonderful. Well, thanks so much for joining us today on the podcast. We appreciate your time. And for anybody listening, if you'd like to suggest a guest, ask a question, or give us any ideas for episodes or content, please reach out to me, Keith Norris, on LinkedIn. You can find me at Keith C. Norris on LinkedIn. And this concludes this episode of the KPI Fireside, a continuous improvement podcast. Go ahead and give us a follow or a like on the appropriate channels, and share this podcast with friends or colleagues who are passionate about continuous improvement. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts, and until next time, keep driving progress and sparking change.